I had been living near the Kaibab forest for a while, so I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Most days were peaceful, spent maintaining the cabin and looking up at the sky, hoping to spot the birds I used to photograph. But one morning I noticed a wild falcon flying low and calling out sharply. Its flight seemed urgent. Curiously, I followed its path across the dry grass, and there, curled up beneath a juniper bush, was a small, trembling kitten. She was a soot-colored ball of fur, too weak to meow and too frightened to move. Surprisingly, the falcon didn't swoop down to attack. Instead, it landed nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the kitten. In that moment, I realized this was no ordinary rescue. The ground was uneven and still chilly from the night's chill. I stepped cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry pine needles, keeping my gaze fixed on the falcon. It was just a few steps from the kitten, its dark feathers contrasting sharply with the golden grass, its focus trained not on me but on her. The kitten looked like a patch of ash against the earth, ribs visible through her dirty fur, and she trembled, even though there was no breeze to disturb the air. She remained silent, not even a whimper escaping her tiny body. I knelt down slowly, observing the falcon as its wings lifted slightly, almost as if preparing for flight, but it stayed put. The bird was a protector, not a predator. I hesitated to reach out, my mind racing with questions. Was the kitten hurt? Had she been abandoned? And why did the falcon lead me to her instead of treating her as prey? Nothing added up. When I finally decided to extend my hand, the kitten flinched but didn't flee. She simply didn't have the energy. I scooped her up gently in the flannel overshirt tied around my waist, cradling her against my chest. She felt weightless, like a mere breath or a wisp of air. At that moment, the falcon let out a sharp cry and took off, soaring quickly into the pale blue sky, disappearing from view. I paused for a moment, my heart racing. I hadn't planned on bringing anything home that day, but sometimes life surprises you, especially in the wild. I felt an odd sense of being chosen in that moment. Once back at the cabin, I cleared the old kitchen table and created a little bed for her, using a wool scarf and a folded towel. She barely moved, just blinking at me with wide, frightened eyes as if she had never experienced kindness before. I warmed a bit of goat milk and grabbed a syringe from my emergency kit to try feeding her. At first, she turned her head away, reluctant to accept anything. But when the first drop brushed her tongue, something changed, perhaps hunger or a flicker of trust. She began to drink, weak and shaky, but eager for more. That night, I kept the fire burning and slept on the couch, the little kitten bundled up beside me. Her breathing was calm but shallow. I hadn't given her a name yet. Names felt like commitments, and I wasn't certain she would make it through the night. But she did. By the third morning, she had gained enough strength to stand and take her first wobbly steps, as if she were testing gravity for the first time. While I brewed coffee, I let her explore a bit. That's when I noticed it through the window. The falcon was back. It sat quietly on a branch near the clearing, its wings neatly folded, almost as if it had come to check on us. I've never been one to believe in signs, at least I hadn't been. But the way the falcon watched the kitten, and how she seemed to recognize it, there was something about that I just couldn't dismiss. The following week, when my niece Mara arrived, I found myself facing questions I wasn't quite ready to answer. Mara showed up that Friday, carrying a worn duffel bag and wearing dusty boots, her eyebrow raised in surprise. "I leave you alone for 6 months and you turn into a falcon-whispering cat dad?" She joked, half amused and half bewildered. I offered her a mug of coffee and shrugged. Didn't exactly plan it. To my surprise, she was gentle with the kitten, crouching down and allowing the little creature to sniff her fingers before scooping her up. "She's warm and alert. How long has she been here?" I explained everything, how the falcon had circled above but never swooped down. I could see Mara was puzzled. "That's not typical," she said quietly. "Birds of prey don't just babysit kittens." Later that afternoon, Mara and I walked back to the clearing where I had first found the kitten. That's when we discovered something unexpected. Tiny paw prints, at least 4 sets, scattered along the brush line. They were smaller than the kitten's but looked fresh. Mara crouched down to examine them. "She must have had siblings," she said softly. "Maybe they're still around." That night, the falcon returned, taking its place on the same branch near the clearing, but this time it called out sharply and deliberately. The kitten perked up, her ears twitching toward the sound. Then she did something I'll never forget. She padded over to the door, sat down, and stared outside, waiting. In that moment, it shifted from just saving her to wondering about what we hadn't yet discovered. The question became, was the falcon trying to show us something more? Sleep eluded me that night. Each time the wind howled or the fire popped, I found myself glancing at the door, half hoping to see those other kittens emerge from the woods. But morning arrived quietly. There were no paw prints, and the falcon was silent. Mara stood outside with a flashlight and her phone, searching the brush near the clearing. "If there are more, they won't last long out here," she said. "Coyotes, snakes, and freezing temperatures at night." She sounded calm, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders. This was more than just a mission for her. It felt like a necessity. We began marking where we'd seen paw prints, leaving out some food and even a piece of one of my flannels to carry the kitten's scent. As dusk approached, the falcon returned, landing on a fence post closer to the cabin. It called out, its wings twitching, and turned its head toward the northern edge of the trees. Mara glanced at me. "I think it wants us to follow." For a moment, I hesitated. The idea of trailing a wild falcon seemed strange, like trusting a forest guide. But the falcon hadn't harmed the kitten, it had led us to her. Now here it was again. Mara picked up a flashlight. If we wait, they could die. But if we follow, there's a chance we might not come back with anything. Still, we have to try. I looked down at the kitten, wrapped snugly in her blanket, her wide eyes fixed on the door. "All right," I said. "Let's follow the bird." That evening, the forest felt different. Not just colder, but charged, as if the trees were holding their breath. Mara and I moved carefully through the underbrush, tracking the falcon's graceful movements above. Its calls echoed down the ridgeline in short, urgent bursts, and now and then it would circle back, pausing to ensure we were still with it. The brush thickened as we continued, tangled with dry manzanita branches and thorny bramble. With each step I took, I felt the weight of time pressing in. How long had the others been out here? Were they still out here at all? After about half a mile, we came upon an old cattle fence that was sagging and nearly falling apart. Beyond it lay a forgotten orchard, a remnant of homesteaders long gone. Rusted buckets hung from the twisted branches of apple trees, and the ground was littered with windfall fruit, sweet but decaying. That's when we heard a sound, not a meow, not quite, that came from beneath a leaning shed at the edge of the orchard. Mara hurried ahead while I crouched low, sweeping my flashlight over the collapsed boards. And there they were, two little kittens, wide-eyed and dirty, huddled together in a nest of leaves. One hissed while the other remained completely still. Before we could reach them, a voice called out from behind us. "You shouldn't be out here." We turned to see Jonas, a local ranger, stepping out from the trees. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and concern was clear on his weathered face. Without raising his voice, he communicated everything we needed to know. His gaze moved from the kittens to the falcon circling above us, and then landed squarely on my expression. "You think you're helping," he said, his tone calm and understanding. "But maybe what they need isn't what you think." His words struck a chord, revealing a truth I had been reluctant to face. I looked down at the two kittens. One was trying to stand while the other lay limp but still breathing. A heavy decision loomed before us. Were we truly saving them, or were we interrupting nature's course? Mara clenched her jaw, her hands steady as she supported the weaker kitten. "They won't survive out here. Not like this." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I sensed her uncertainty, mirroring my own struggle. The falcon stayed nearby, perched on a broken branch, observing without passing judgment. It seemed less like a guide now and more like a witness, awaiting our next move. In that moment, it was hard to tell if we were doing the right thing or if we were overstepping our bounds in a world that had its own wisdom. As twilight drew closer, we made our way back to the cabin, the kittens wrapped gently in Mara's jacket. Their tiny bodies barely stirred. Jonas walked alongside us, his silence only interrupted by the occasional sigh as his boot caught on roots or stones. Although he hadn't voiced his objections when we took the kittens, I could feel his disapproval like a chill in the air. He believed in letting nature be, stepping in only when absolutely necessary. Even now, I found myself questioning if we were rescuing them or simply intruding under the guise of compassion. Just as we neared the edge of the clearing, the falcon let out a sudden, piercing cry and veered sharply, circling over the dry stream bed that cut through the forest. Mara and I halted. Then we heard it, a sound that felt out of place. It wasn't animalistic. It carried a metallic groan, as if something hefty was shifting. Jonas stepped ahead, shining his flashlight, and what he uncovered left us in shock. There, half collapsed and obscured by pine needles and moss, was an old wire trap. Inside, pressed against a rusted edge, was another kitten. It looked older and stronger, yet its leg was caught, twisted awkwardly in the trap's hinge. The kitten looked up at us, wide-eyed but not panicked, as if it had been waiting for us to arrive. Jonas crouched down, breathing out slowly through his nose. This trap wasn't meant for kittens. His gaze traveled along the edge of the trees. Someone's been hunting out here. In that moment, it became clear that our situation had turned into something much more serious. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. There was a darker reality lurking just out of sight. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere felt different, almost oppressive, as if the forest had come home with us. We had just managed to free the third kitten from the trap. Jonas worked carefully with a set of wire cutters from his truck, murmuring to himself all the while. The injury wasn't critical, but the little one's leg was swollen, and it trembled as if it could sense the danger. Inside, Mara took charge of the kittens, creating a cozy space for them in a padded crate by the fire. Meanwhile, I boiled some water and crushed up antibiotics, trying to process everything that had happened. Miri, the first kitten Mara named without asking, refused to leave the injured one's side. She nestled close, gently licking his ears in steady strokes. It amazed me how much she had changed in just a few days. She was no longer just surviving, she was becoming a source of comfort. The falcon hadn't returned, but I found myself stepping outside frequently, scanning the tree line. Was I hoping to see those dark wings again? Perhaps. It felt as if the falcon had been guiding us from the start, not just to the kittens, but toward a larger lesson or challenge. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Jonas stood on the porch longer than usual, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the shadows growing across the clearing. "Whoever set that trap," he finally said, "they'll be back. And I doubt they're interested in finding animals." That night, as the woods settled into silence and Mara drifted off on the couch, I found myself by the fire, listening to the gentle breaths of the kittens. It hit me then. We weren't just caring for kittens anymore. We were balancing something much more delicate, a link between the wild and the familiar, between predator and prey, between instinct and trust. Every breath they took seemed to ask us, "Will you stick with us through this?" By the fifth day, the cabin was no longer filled with the scent of cedar and ash, but rather with the smell of milk, antiseptic, and soft kitten fur. The fire was always crackling, as was our worry. Miri had taken on a protective role, grooming and snuggling the other kittens, surprisingly maternal despite her own size. The one with the injured leg, now named Alder by Mara, was healing, albeit slowly. The others were starting to play, gently nudging at twine and chasing shadows. It was a reminder that life continued here, even with the fear that had shaped their initial days. However, the question of what to do next felt heavy in the air. I had contacted a local shelter, but it was full, underfunded, and hardly operational. Jonas mentioned he could try to help, but even he worried about the animals' fate. If they showed signs of trauma, they could be euthanized. And they did. Each one flinched at sudden movements and froze at loud noises, their eyes wide and hearts racing. They weren't ready for cages or cold cement floors, for the harsh sounds of other animals in distress. One night, Mara stood by the window with her arms folded tightly. "We can't keep them all," she said. I nodded in agreement, though I hadn't fully accepted it. Letting them go after everything we'd been through felt like cutting a thread that connected me to the world. Mara turned to me, her eyes glistening and her jaw set. If we give them up now, everything we did, what was it for? I didn't have an answer. Perhaps only the falcon knew, and it hadn't been seen in 2 days. its absence added to the weight of our decision. Between the flickering firelight and the encroaching darkness outside, an unspoken question lingered. If we can't keep them, how do we manage to let them go? Morning arrived with a striking red sky, the kind that often made me uneasy, too bright, almost painful, as if the earth was revealing its silent burdens. I had woken up early, hours before Mara, and found myself sitting on the back step with a mug of cold coffee, staring at the field where the falcon had last rested. Still no sign of it, just the wind, frost, and the echoes of choices I was yet to make. Inside, the kittens stirred, one of them mewing softly for food. I fed them, as I always did, slowly and deliberately, allowing them to warm against my palm, completely unaware of the situation unfolding around them. When Mara joined me, I noticed a different expression on her face, less frustration and more acceptance. She sat down beside the crate, her fingers tracing absent circles around its edge. "We should split them," she said quietly. "I can take two. Maybe Luna could foster one. It's not perfect, but they'd have a safe place. It's something." I could hear the tremor in her voice, the grief already preparing for the heartache of separation. As I stood there, it became clear what was unsaid. The possibility of keeping all four of them was slipping away, like a door quietly closing. I found myself in a tough spot, caught between wanting to hold on and realizing that maybe I had to let them go. The thought of this being our limit was hard to accept, yet underneath that struggle lay a deeper fear. If I chose the right path, I might lose the unexpected comfort these little lives had brought into mine. However, time kept ticking. I couldn't delay this decision forever. That night, a cold wind swept through, rattling the windows and swirling pine needles outside. Sleep evaded me. Each time I shut my eyes, their faces appeared. Miri's quiet determination, Alder's weary stare, and the others huddled together, as if trying to remember how to be united instead of separate. Eventually, close to dawn, I got up, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and sat next to the crate. Miri opened her eyes and looked right at me. In that moment, I felt a mix of question and trust reflected in her gaze. Jonas arrived early that morning, his truck crunching over the gravel with a slow deliberation that made me uneasy. He stepped out holding a carrier, a solid plastic box with a metal gate in front. "Flagstaff's shelter can take two," he said, scanning the cabin as though he didn't want to take in too much. Mara came out of the kitchen, her lips pressed together and a towel in her hands that had seen better days. "What about the other two?" she inquired. Jonas hesitated before responding. "They'll go to a holding house in Sedona," he finally said. "It's not perfect, temporary, but it's all we have." I shifted my gaze from him to Mara and then down to the four of them. Miri was already sitting up, positioning herself as a tiny protector in front of the others. My throat tightened. This wasn't just about the kittens anymore. It was about what it truly means to care. Not the simple romantic idea, but the hard truth, where love involves recognizing when you're capable of enough and when you aren't. I had to make a choice. Was I prepared to let them go, or was I ready to commit to staying with them? I remained quiet, the air thick with the smell of firewood smoke and warmed milk, a stillness that felt like the calm before a storm, or the moment just before a heartfelt confession. The carrier Jonas set down looked like an answer I wasn't ready to confront. Outside, the trees stood still, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath alongside me. Jonas lingered at the room's edge, looking down, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. The tension in his jaw hinted at discomfort he couldn't quite express. On the opposite side, Mara leaned against the counter. Her expression was hard to read, but she exuded a sense of belief. Not in simplicity or ease, but in the part of me I had long tried to hide beneath layers of solitary routines. I settled onto a crate, my knees creaking, and the familiar ache of age reminding me of the space between making a choice and feeling regret. Miri was the first to move, stepping out purposefully without a moment's hesitation. She nestled against my leg, heart thrumming against me, not asking for safety but offering it. One by one, the others joined her, forming a quiet group of need I could no longer ignore. When I finally found my voice, it came out steady yet worn, like an old door that had rarely been opened. "No carriers," I said. "They're staying." Jonas regarded me in silence, the weight of his quiet more formidable than any argument. As I stood up, the morning light shifted, casting a golden glow just as a dark shape circled slowly overhead, its wings wide and silent before disappearing among the trees. Weeks went by, and the cabin settled into a new rhythm, not dominated by silence anymore, but alive with the sound of paws thumping against the wood, the occasional crash of something getting knocked off a shelf, and the soothing purring that filled the still moments like gentle rain. Miri remained the heart of it all, still small, yet no longer fragile. Her strength evident not just in size, but in the confidence with which she moved through the house, as if she had always belonged here. Alder's leg began to heal, though he would likely carry a limp for life. The others grew bolder, exploring further each day, melding the spaces of our worlds into something shared, something unspoken but undeniably ours. Jonas visited less frequently, but when he did, he brought supplies rather than questions. Sometimes Mara accompanied him, her hands instinctively reaching for whichever kitten darted in her direction, her voice softer now and less guarded. She and I stopped talking about letting go. It seemed unnecessary. The falcon hasn't shown up again, not in a way I can see. Yet on certain days, when the wind blows just right, I catch a distant cry high above the trees. It gives me some comfort to think that it's aware. Perhaps it lingered just long enough to guide me back to something I didn't even realize I had lost. This brings me to a thought about what rescue really means. It may not always be about fixing what's broken, but rather allowing ourselves to be changed by what we believed needed our help. If this reflection resonates with you, if it makes you reconsider the idea of rescue, not merely as an act of mending, but also as one of listening, then it has likely touched the right heart. It's important to remember that rescue isn't solely about saving animals. Sometimes it's a powerful reminder of what connection truly entails, even when it comes in unexpected forms, like a fleeting bird or a tiny kitten struggling to survive. If you found this story impactful, don't keep it to yourself. Share it and allow others to experience those same feelings. And if you'd like to continue exploring this journey with us, one surprise rescue at a time, stay connected. We have more stories to share. Some wrap up nicely, while others are still unfolding. Perhaps one of those stories will find you next.